Welcome to our 108th step in our walking tour through the Bible. And today we're going to look at chapter 18 of the first book of the Kings, which is the very famous contest between Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this story is what's not said. We're not told any backstory, where Elijah comes from, how he grew up, what he did. Elijah doesn't seem sort of like a normal sort of person. He sort of appears here and there and disappears here and there. Elijah arose, we're told in the New Testament, like a storm in the desert. He sort of suddenly appeared. Again, like John the Baptist, we're told, appears. Elijah is not really an ordinary sort of person. Now, in chapter 18, he meets Obadiah, who is a prime minister, shall we say, but who's also a sincere follower of the Lord, unlike his master Ahab. And he tells him, "Tell Ahab I'm here." He spent 3 years hiding, as we'll find, because Obadiah tells him it's very clear that Ahab wants to kill him. And also, if Elijah does not present himself, he suddenly disappears again, Ahab will just kill Obadiah. So Ahab is pretty out of control when it comes to the mention of Elijah. Now, the odd thing is, Elijah has prophesied back in chapter 17 there'll be no rain until he says so. But apart from that, there's no record, at least in the Bible, of Elijah's meetings with Ahab. But clearly, Elijah and Ahab know each other for a very long time. And for Ahab, Elijah is an object of fear and loathing. So we're told that Elijah, then Ahab went to find Elijah. This is verse 17. When he saw Elijah, Ahab said, "So there you are, you scourge of Israel." "Not I," Elijah replied. "I am not the scourge of Israel. You and your family are, because you have deserted the Lord and followed Baal." Now, we've got something. So clearly, relations have gone wrong between these two. There's no dialogue, is there? There is just enmity. They are both on different sides. Elijah rebukes the king very strongly for his apostasy. He was a follower of the Lord, now he's become a follower of Baal. Elijah speaks truth to power. This is very important. Elijah's a prophet, and that is what prophets are supposed to do. They are supposed to upbraid the people in power when they do wrong. They're not there to make the people in power feel good about themselves or feel comfortable. They're there to redirect the people in power onto the right path when they've strayed. And we saw a model of this, if you remember, when the prophet Nathan went in to upbraid King David for his murder of the Hittite Uriah. Then the other thing is very strange here, and incidentally, you might ask yourself, well, is this what the church is doing? Because this is what the church is meant to do. It's meant to be a prophetic church. And are we upbraiding those who've gone off the right path strongly enough? We tend to be very cowardly when it comes to this divinely given mission to upbraid the sinful, to rebuke the sinful. Quite often, we need to rebuke the sinful, for example, all the undemocratic forces in the world, all the corrupt politicians, all the tyrants in the world need to be rebuked, just as King Ahab's being rebuked here. King Ahab is bad, as we know, according to the Bible. But, there are people, I think, nowadays who are much worse than King Ahab. We must rebuke, for example, the president of Russia. We must rebuke the president of Turkey. We must rebuke the rulers of China, particularly the rulers of China who hold people in slavery and threaten and oppress the people of Tibet and threaten war against Taiwan on a more or less daily basis. We must rebuke those authorities in India who persecute Christians at a local level. We must rebuke those leaders who fail to provide good and lawful government to their peoples in various parts of the world, including Africa, not just Africa. There are other places as well. So this rebuking, it's tough. And of course, it's dangerous. Elijah has been in hiding for the last 3 years, don't forget, because as a rebuker of the tyrannical king Ahab, Ahab has wanted to kill him. And that, of course, proves why Ahab should be rebuked, because if you try and criticize him, he doesn't enter into dialogue, he just tries to kill you. Okay, and the other thing that's very strange about what Elijah says to Ahab is this. So it's not me who's a scourge of Israel, you and your family are. Now, this is very strange. I'll tell you why it's very strange, because he says the blame is personal to you. Your fault, Ahab, you and your family, i.e. your wife and your children, maybe your father, Omri, the great king before you. You are the ones who are responsible for this. Now, this is not the modern way, the modern theological way of doing it, really. Nowadays, we love to talk about structures of sin. And we love to say, oh, well, it's not just the person at the top who's responsible. It's all the people who carry out their orders. It's all the structures they've set up. It's a community fault. You know, they are all guilty, or we are all guilty. But, and this is important for us to remember, there is personal responsibility as well. Ahab is guilty. He can't hide behind the fact that the whole of Israel is guilty. No, in fact, the emphasis seems to be that the whole of Israel can be redeemed, as we'll see. It's Ahab and Jezebel who are the guilty couple. Now, if you think about this carefully, it's not something that we tend to emphasize these days. For example, you might have read a book. If you haven't read it, do read it. It's an interesting book. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a book I agree with or a good book, but it's certainly a very interesting book. It's very well written. Daniel Jonah Goldhagen's Hitler's Willing Executioners, in which Jonah Goldhagen does prove that probably about 300,000 people at least were active participants in the Holocaust. Therefore, the idea that the Holocaust was the responsibility of one man is simply not true. It's Hitler's fault, obviously, but not just Hitler. There were 300,000 other people, all of whom could have opted out of taking part in the Holocaust, but didn't. And then there's a bigger circle of people, millions of people, who didn't know anything but should have known or enabled the guilty parties to do their work. In other words, the Holocaust was the fault of millions of people, and they were enabled to do this by the structures that were set up by the Nazis, but they themselves made those structures possible. Very few people actually protested against the Nazi tyranny. The few who did were, of course, usually executed. Most people who knew it was wrong kept quiet. Now, but that I think is a broadly true picture. But here, it's all Ahab's fault. It's not the fault of anybody else. It's all Ahab's fault. It's all Jezebel's fault, which is interesting, I think. Now, in other words, Ahab is a scourge of Israel. Ahab is a seducer of Israel. He's led Israel off the right path, just as he has been led off the right path, presumably by Jezebel. Anyway, then Elijah stages this famous competition on Mount Carmel. And in the end, the priests of Baal are unable to summon the divine fire to consume their sacrifice. Why? Because Baal is not a god. Baal is an illusion. Baal is not real. And of course, Elijah mocks them. Maybe he has turned aside. Maybe he has gone on a journey. Maybe he is musing, he says. I think I might be using an older translation there. Perhaps he is asleep and needs to be woken up. So they shouted louder and gashed themselves, as their custom was, with swords and spears, until the blood flowed down on them. Midday passed. And they ranted on until the time when the offering was presented. There was no voice, no answer, no sign of attention. It's verse 29. So Baal is impotent, and then he invokes the Lord God. He rebuilds the altar. He places the sacrifice on the altar. He has it covered with water, and he invokes the Lord God, and the Lord God answered. Now, his invocation of the Lord God is rather interesting. He says, Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let them know today that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant, that I've done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so this people may know that you, the Lord, are God, and winning back their hearts. And God answers. And there's a huge conflagration. All the people fall down on their faces. Then Ahab goes off in his chariot and is overtaken by this huge rainstorm, another sign of God's power, and he takes the 450 defeated prophets of God down to the brook Kidron and Kishon rather, and he kills them, which is, it's always struck me as being a bit unkind, but there you go. And so the Lord God proves himself before the whole of Israel gathered on Mount Carmel. This story is extraordinary from a final point, which is, what about all those people who've called upon the Lord God to prove himself and to prove himself by a miracle, and he hasn't? What about all those people who have desperately, desperately wanted the Lord to show himself, and there's been no sign? Do we really seek signs and wonders? This is an evil and adulterous generation, Jesus says of his own contemporaries, that wants a sign. Elijah has provided a sign, but we, I don't think, are going to get a sign. We're asked to have faith. We're asked to follow the Lord without these astonishing signs that are given on Mount Carmel. So it's a very sort of bittersweet tale, this. The Lord shows himself. But we know, don't we, that on the whole, the Lord doesn't show himself very much. So the Lord shows himself on Mount Carmel, but did he show himself on Mount Calvary? Yes, he did, as a matter of fact, but not quite in the same way. It's interesting. On this mountain, so many mountains where so many theophanies take place, and yet God often is the God who remains hidden. All the very best. Speak to you soon. Bye.